Sometimes the deepest grief makes a man disappear from the world, and sometimes the world finds a way to call him back. 3 winters had passed since Jedediah Kane buried his boy, 3 winters of silence that had frozen his heart solid as the mountain peaks. On a bitter December night, he heard crying in the snow, not human, but desperate all the same. He found a pregnant wolf, chained and beaten, left to die in the cold. Most folks would have walked away, but Jed had known suffering, and he couldn't leave her there. He carried her to his cabin and tended her wounds. When her pups were born, something beautiful happened between the broken man and the rescued wolf. But would this unlikely friendship be enough to heal the pain that had haunted him for 3 long years? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cabin stood like a weathered prayer against the mountain's face, its logs darkened by decades of snow and sun. Jedediah Kane had built it with his own hands 23 years ago, back when his world held laughter and the promise of tomorrow, back when Sarah's voice would call him in for supper and young Thomas would race through the door with dirt on his knees and wonder in his eyes. Now the silence pressed against the walls like a living thing. Jed moved through his morning routine with the mechanical precision of a man who had forgotten why he bothered. Coffee first, black and bitter, the way Sarah used to scold him for drinking it. He'd promised her he'd add cream, promised her a lot of things he never got the chance to keep. The wedding ring hung heavy on the chain around his neck, a gold weight that had become as much a part of him as his own heartbeat. The wolf lay on a nest of old quilts near the wood stove, her breathing shallow but steady. Her dark fur was matted with dried blood, and angry welts marked where the chains had bitten into her flesh. But her eyes, those amber eyes, held an intelligence that reminded Jed of someone he'd once known. Someone who'd looked at him with that same mixture of wariness and hope. "Easy now, girl," he murmured, kneeling beside her with a bowl of warm broth. "Nobody's gonna hurt you here." The wolf's ears twitched at the sound of his voice. It was the first time he'd spoken aloud in months, and the words felt rusty in his throat. He'd stopped talking when there was nobody left to listen, when the silence became easier than the echo of his own voice bouncing off empty walls. This cabin had once been the heart of something beautiful. Sarah had sewn curtains for the windows, cheerful yellow fabric that caught the morning light and made the whole place glow like a lantern. Thomas had carved his initials in the wooden beam above the fireplace when he turned 12, standing on his tiptoes to reach high enough while Jed held the ladder steady. The boy had been so proud of that crooked TC that he'd shown it to every visitor for months afterward. All of that was gone now. The curtains had rotted away 3 summers back, and Jed never bothered to replace them. He'd considered sanding down that beam more times than he could count, but somehow his hands always found other work when he got close to it. Some things were too sacred to erase, even when they cut like knives every time you looked at them. The wolf stirred, lifting her massive head just enough to sniff at the broth. Her belly was swollen with the weight of pups, and Jed could see the faint movements beneath her fur as they shifted restlessly inside her. New life, fighting to enter a world that had shown their mother nothing but cruelty. "You remind me of someone," Jed said softly, settling back on his heels. "She was stubborn too, wouldn't let anybody help her until she was good and ready. Sarah, her name was. The prettiest woman in 3 counties, though she'd box my ears if she heard me say it." The wolf's eyes fixed on his face, and for a moment Jed could almost believe she understood. Animals had always been drawn to Sarah. Birds would land on her shoulders while she hung laundry, and deer would emerge from the forest edge just to watch her tend her garden. She'd had a gift, some kind of gentle magic that made wild things trust her. "She'd know what to do for you," Jed continued, his voice growing rougher. "Always did have a way with hurt creatures. Nursed more rabbits and raccoons back to health than I could count. Thomas, too, when he'd come home, scraped up from one adventure or another. The memories came flooding back without invitation. Thomas at 5, sobbing over a baby bird that had fallen from its nest. Sarah showing him how to make a tiny splint from matchsticks and tape, how to feed it with an eyedropper, how to build a safe place for it to heal. The boy's face when the bird finally took flight again. That pure joy that children felt before the world taught them to be careful with their hearts. Thomas at 8, begging to help with the trap lines, promising he was old enough and responsible enough to handle a real job. Jed teaching him to read animal signs, to move quietly through the forest, to respect the creatures they tracked even as they sought to catch them. "Every animal's got a purpose," he told the boy. "Our job ain't to judge that purpose, just to understand it." Thomas at 15, tall and lanky like his father, but with his mother's gentle way with frightened animals. The boy who'd wanted to be a naturalist, who'd filled notebook after notebook with drawings of animal tracks and observations about their behavior. The boy who died because he'd inherited his father's stubborn courage, along with his mother's tender heart. Jed's hands clenched into fists, and he had to fight back the familiar surge of rage and self-hatred. 3 years, and the wound still felt fresh as the day it happened. Some mornings he woke up expecting to hear Thomas's boots on the cabin floor, expecting to see him hunched over his journal at the kitchen table, sketching another set of tracks or writing notes about which birds were returning for spring. The wolf made a soft whining sound, pulling Jed back to the present. She was trying to lift her head higher, her nose working as she caught some scent on the winter air. Jed followed her gaze to the window, where the first pale light of dawn was beginning to filter through the glass. "You smell something out there, girl?" he asked, rising to peer through the frost-covered pane. The snow had stopped falling sometime during the night, leaving the world wrapped in pristine white silence. But there were tracks in the fresh powder, boot prints leading up to the cabin and circling around it before disappearing back into the trees. Someone had been watching, studying the place while Jed slept. His hand moved instinctively to the rifle mounted above the door. 3 years of isolation had made him careful, maybe too careful. But a man who rescued wolves from torture couldn't be too trusting of his fellow humans. Whoever had chained this animal and left her to die was still out there, and they might not appreciate Jed's interference. The wolf tried to struggle to her feet, her protective instincts flaring despite her injuries. Jed knelt beside her again, placing a gentle hand on her flank. "Easy now. Whoever it was, they're gone. We're safe for now." But even as he said it, Jed knew that safety was probably an illusion. He'd broken his 3-year isolation for this wounded creature, and that decision was going to have consequences. People would start asking questions, and questions led to attention he didn't want. The wolf settled back onto her quilts, but her ears remained pricked and alert. She understood danger better than most humans, understood that survival meant staying ready to fight or flee at a moment's notice. Jed respected that wisdom. He'd learned it himself the hard way. As the morning light strengthened, Jed set about his daily tasks with unusual purpose. The wolf would need more than broth if she was going to regain her strength. He had some dried venison that he could soften in warm milk, and Sarah's old medical kit still contained herbs that might help with the infection he could see setting into her wounds. Sarah's medical kit. He hadn't opened that leather satchel in 3 years, couldn't bear to touch the tools she'd used to heal both animals and people with such gentle skill. But the wolf needed help, and Sarah would have been the first to set aside grief for the sake of a suffering creature. The kit sat on a high shelf in the bedroom, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from dust and moisture. Jed's hands trembled as he unwrapped it, revealing the neat rows of glass vials and bundled herbs, the small instruments she'd used for stitching wounds and setting broken bones. Everything was exactly as she'd left it, organized with the careful precision of someone who might need to find something vital in the dark. "Echinacea for infection," he murmured, reading the labels in Sarah's careful handwriting. "Comfrey for wound healing." She taught Thomas all this, wanted him to know how to help things that were hurting. The irony wasn't lost on him. His son had died because Jed hadn't been there to help when it mattered most. All the knowledge in the world couldn't undo that failure, couldn't bring back the boy who'd bled out alone in the woods while his father was off on some fool errand in town. But maybe it could save this wolf. Maybe it could save her unborn pups. Maybe that was enough reason to open his heart, just wide enough to let healing begin. The wolf watched him work with those intelligent amber eyes, seeming to understand that he was preparing medicine for her. When he approached with the herbal tea he'd brewed, she didn't shy away. She let him clean her wounds with the warm liquid, let him apply the healing salve that Sarah had taught him to make from comfrey and calendula. "You're going to be a mama soon," Jed told her as he worked. "Your little ones are going to need you strong and healthy. They're going to need you to teach them how to survive in a world that ain't always kind to their kind." The wolf's tail thumped once against the quilts, the first sign of anything approaching contentment since he'd found her. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a victory. Like maybe, just maybe, he was doing something right for the first time in 3 long years. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending snow devils dancing across the yard. Winter was far from over, and the wolf's pups would be born into a world of cold and uncertainty. But here in this cabin, surrounded by the ghosts of love and loss, something new was beginning to grow. Something that might, if he was very careful and very lucky, heal them both. The wolf nearly died in the night. Jed woke to the sound of labored breathing, a wet rattle that cut through his dreams like a blade. He'd been dreaming of Thomas again, the boy laughing as he chased fireflies in the summer twilight, his jaw glowing with captured light. But the sound pulled him back to the cold reality of the cabin, where death was stalking another innocent creature. The wolf's fever had spiked, and her body convulsed with chills that shook the entire nest of quilts. Her amber eyes had lost their focus, staring at something beyond the cabin walls, beyond the world of the living. Jed knelt beside her, his hands hovering helplessly over her trembling form. "Come on, girl. Don't you give up on me now." He'd seen this before too many times. The moment when a wounded animal's spirit began to slip away, when the body decided that healing required more strength than it possessed. Sarah had called it the choosing time, when a creature had to decide whether life was worth the pain of fighting for it. Jed wrapped the wolf in every blanket he could find, built up the fire until the cabin felt like a furnace, and began the long vigil that he'd hoped never to face again. He bathed her burning skin with cool water, forced drops of willow bark tea between her clenched teeth, and talked to her in the low, steady voice that Sarah had used during the worst nights of Thomas's childhood fevers. "You got babies counting on you," he whispered, stroking the coarse fur behind her ears. "They need their mama. They need you to be strong enough to teach them how to hunt, how to run, how to be wild and free like you were meant to be." But as the hours crawled by, Jed found himself thinking less about the wolf's pups and more about another child who'd needed his mother. Thomas had been barely 2 when Sarah fell ill with the wasting sickness that took her slowly, day by agonizing day. The boy hadn't understood why Mama couldn't get out of bed, why she grew thinner and paler with each passing week, why Daddy spent so much time kneeling beside her with tears in his eyes. "Promise me you'll take care of him," Sarah had whispered during one of her last coherent moments. "Promise me you'll teach him to be kind, Jed. The world's got enough hardness already." He'd promised and he'd tried. For 13 years after Sarah's death, he'd done his best to be both father and mother to the boy. He'd taught Thomas to hunt and fish, to read the signs of weather and season, to respect the land and the creatures that shared it. But somehow he'd failed to teach him the most important lesson of all: how to stay safe when his father wasn't there to protect him. The memory hit him like a physical blow, as fresh and brutal as the day it happened. Thomas at 15, eager to prove himself on his first solo hunting trip. The boy had begged for months to be allowed to check the trap lines alone, arguing that he knew the routes as well as his father, that he was careful and responsible and ready for the responsibility. Jed had finally agreed. Partly because the boy's pleading wore him down, but mostly because he'd had business in town that couldn't wait. Legal papers to sign, supplies to buy, a dozen mundane errands that had seemed important at the time. He'd kissed Thomas goodbye that morning, told him to be careful, and ridden away without a backward glance. He'd found the boy 6 hours later, caught in one of his own snares, his leg mangled, and his life bleeding away into the forest floor. The trap had been set wrong, a mistake no experienced hunter would have made, but Thomas was still learning. He'd tried to free himself, but the more he struggled, the deeper the wire had cut. By the time Jed arrived, drawn by the boy's weakening cries, it was too late for anything but holding him as he died. "I'm sorry, Pa," Thomas had whispered, his young face grey with pain and blood loss. "I tried to do it right. I tried to make you proud." Those were the last words his son ever spoke. The boy had died, thinking he'd disappointed his father, when the truth was that Jed had failed him completely. A good father would have stayed with his son, would have been there to guide him through the danger. A good father would have put his child's safety above a few papers and a handful of supplies. The wolf's breathing grew more labored, pulling Jed back to the present crisis. Her tongue lolled from her mouth, and the pups in her belly had stopped their restless movement. He could lose them all tonight, mother and babies, just like he'd lost Sarah and Thomas. The pattern of his life seemed to be loving things until they died, protecting them until the moment he failed them most completely. "No," he said aloud, his voice harsh in the quiet cabin. "Not this time. I won't let you go without a fight." He gathered Sarah's medical kit and spread its contents across the floor, searching for anything that might tip the balance toward life. The infection in the wolf's wounds had spread, and her body was burning itself out trying to fight it. She needed something stronger than herbal tea and gentle nursing. Deep in the kit, wrapped in oiled paper, he found what he was looking for. Penicillin tablets that Sarah had saved from her own illness, unused because she died before they could help her. The paper label was yellowed with age, but the medicine might still be effective. It was a risk. Animal physiology was different from human, and the dosage could be wrong. But doing nothing was a certain death sentence. Jed crushed half a tablet and mixed it with warm broth, then used a syringe from the kit to force the mixture down the wolf's throat. She struggled weakly, but he persisted, talking to her in the same tone he'd used to coax medicine into Thomas during childhood illnesses. "Come on, girl. This is gonna help. I know it tastes terrible, but Sarah always said the worst-tasting medicine worked the best." The night stretched on like a trial by ordeal. Jed dozed fitfully in a chair beside the wolf, waking every hour to check her breathing, to offer water, to stroke her fur and whisper encouragement. Each time he opened his eyes, he half expected to find her still and cold. Another life lost to his inadequate care, but when dawn finally broke over the mountains, painting the cabin walls with pale gold light, the wolf's fever had broken. Her breathing was deeper and more regular, and when Jed touched her nose, it was cool and wet. She lifted her head and looked at him with clear, focused eyes, eyes that held what could almost be called gratitude. "That's my girl," Jed whispered, his voice thick with relief and something he hadn't felt in 3 years. "Hope. You're gonna make it. You and your babies are gonna be just fine." The wolf's tail moved weakly against the quilts, and she managed to lap a few drops of water from his cupped palm. It was a small victory, but it felt like a resurrection. For the first time since Thomas died, Jed had fought for a life and won. As he prepared fresh food for his patient, Jed found himself humming an old song that Sarah used to sing while she worked in her garden. The melody came back to him as naturally as breathing, along with words about hope and healing and the promise of spring after the longest winter. Outside, snow began to fall again, but inside the cabin, something had fundamentally changed. The wolf was going to live, and her pups would be born into a world where at least one human being cared enough to fight for their survival. Maybe that would be enough. Maybe for once in his life that would be enough. Recovery was slow, like watching ice melt on a mountain lake. The wolf's strength returned in small increments, a lifted head here, a few laps of water there, the gradual return of alertness to those amber eyes. Jed found himself talking to her more each day, his voice growing stronger as hers grew steadier. "You know what Thomas would have said about you?" he asked one morning as he changed the dressing on her wounds. "He'd have said you were a fighter, just like his mama. Boy always did admire creatures that wouldn't give up, no matter how bad things got. The wolf's ears pricked forward at the sound of her caretaker's voice. Over the past week, she'd begun to associate his presence with food, warmth, and the absence of pain. Trust was building between them, delicate as spun glass, but growing stronger each day. Jed reached for Thomas's hunting knife to cut fresh bandages from an old sheet. The bone handle was smooth from years of use, carved with the boy's initials, and a small deer that he'd etched there when he was 12. Thomas had been so proud of that knife, had carried it everywhere, and kept it sharp enough to shave with. Now it felt like holding a piece of his son's spirit, warm and familiar in Jed's weathered palm. "He made this himself, you know," Jed said, showing the knife to the wolf, as if she could appreciate the craftsmanship. Spent 3 months working on it in the evenings, whittling away at that handle until it fit his hand just right. Boy had patience when it came to things he cared about. The memory brought a bittersweet smile to Jed's lips. Thomas had been meticulous about his tools, just like his mother. Sarah had taught them both that taking care of your equipment was a way of taking care of yourself. That a sharp knife or a well-maintained trap could mean the difference between success and failure in the wilderness. As Jed worked, the wolf began to show signs of the personality that had helped her survive torture and abandonment. She was particular about her food, refusing the venison broth if it wasn't warm enough, but lapping it eagerly when the temperature was just right. She watched Jed's movements with the intense focus of a predator, cataloging his habits and learning to predict his actions. Most tellingly, she had claimed the corner near the wood stove as her territory. Any time Jed approached with firewood or tried to adjust the damper, she would lift her head and emit a low rumble, not quite a growl, but a clear statement of ownership. It reminded him of Sarah claiming the kitchen as her domain, gently but firmly establishing that certain spaces belonged to her alone. "Getting bossy, are we?" Jed chuckled as the wolf fixed him with a stern look when he moved her water bowl a few inches to the left. "Well, I suppose a mama's got to look out for her young ones. Speaking of which, seems like they're getting mighty active in there." The wolf's belly had grown noticeably larger, and the movements within were becoming more pronounced. Jed could see the ripple of tiny paws pressing against her sides, and sometimes at night he could hear soft whimpering sounds that seemed to come from the unborn pups themselves. They would arrive soon, probably within the week. The thought filled him with equal measures of anticipation and terror. He'd helped deliver foals and calves back when he and Sarah had kept livestock, but wolf pups were different. Wild creatures had their own ways, their own needs that domestic animals had bred out of themselves over generations of human care. "Your mama's gonna know what to do," he told the wolf's belly, feeling slightly foolish but continuing anyway. "Animals always know these things better than humans do. We tend to complicate what ought to be simple." Thomas had been fascinated by animal births. The boy had read every book he could find about wildlife reproduction, had filled his journals with observations about nesting behaviors and maternal instincts. He dreamed of becoming a naturalist, of studying animals in their wild habitats and writing papers about their behaviors. He would have loved to see this, Jed murmured, his hand resting gently on the wolf's flank. "Boy was always asking me to bring him along when I found injured animals. Wanted to learn everything about how to help them heal." The wolf turned her head to look at him, and for a moment Jed could have sworn he saw understanding in her eyes. She shifted position slightly, moving closer to his hand rather than away from it. The gesture was small but significant. A wild animal choosing to seek comfort from a human, trusting him enough to let down her guard. That afternoon, as snow fell steadily outside the windows, Jed began preparing for the birth. He gathered clean rags and towels, boiled water for sterilization, and set up a larger nesting area, using every soft blanket and quilt he could spare. The wolf watched his preparations with keen interest, occasionally sniffing at the materials he brought near her. When he spread out Thomas's old sleeping bag, the one the boy had used on camping trips, the wolf's reaction was immediate and surprising. She struggled to her feet, ignoring the protest from her healing wounds, and began arranging the sleeping bag with her nose and paws. She pulled and tugged at the fabric until it formed a perfect circle, then settled into the center with a satisfied sigh. "Well, I'll be," Jed breathed. "You've got taste, girl." That sleeping bag cost me 3 months' worth of trap money, but Thomas loved it more than anything. Said it was like sleeping in a cloud. The wolf had chosen Thomas's sleeping bag as her birthing nest. Whether it was the softness of the material or some lingering scent that spoke to her animal instincts, she had claimed it as the safest place for her pups to enter the world. The symbolism wasn't lost on Jed. New life taking shelter in something that had belonged to his lost son. As evening approached and the wolf grew increasingly restless, Jed found himself thinking about names. He tried to maintain emotional distance, telling himself that she was just a wild animal he was helping, that attachment would only lead to more heartbreak. But watching her prepare to give birth in his son's sleeping bag, he realized that distance was a luxury he could no longer afford. "Sarah," he said suddenly, the name feeling right on his tongue. "That's what I'll call you. Not because you look like her, but because you've got her spirit. That stubborn refusal to give up, no matter how dark things get." The wolf, Sarah, lifted her head at the sound of her new name. Her tail moved once against the sleeping bag. A small acknowledgement that seemed to seal the bond between them. Outside, the wind howled through the pine trees, rattling the cabin walls and driving snow against the windows. But inside, in the golden circle of firelight, a man who had forgotten how to hope was remembering what it felt like to care for something beyond his own pain. Tomorrow, if all went well, there would be new life in the cabin. Tiny, helpless creatures who would depend on their mother's strength and their unlikely human protector's willingness to fight for them. For the first time in 3 years, Jed found himself looking forward to tomorrow. The storm hit just as Sarah went into labor. It began as a whisper of wind against the cabin walls, but within hours it had grown into a howling beast that shook the entire structure. Snow drove against the windows like handfuls of thrown rice, and the temperature dropped so fast that ice began forming on the inside of the glass. Jed had seen blizzards before, but this one felt different, angry and relentless, as if nature itself was testing his resolve. Sarah paced restlessly around the cabin, her breathing shallow and rapid. Every few minutes she would stop, arch her back, and release a low whine that cut through Jed's heart like a blade. He'd seen enough animal births to recognize the signs, but this felt more urgent, more desperate than it should have. "Easy, girl," he murmured, kneeling beside her as she settled into Thomas's sleeping bag for the 100th time. "Your babies are just eager to meet the world. Nothing wrong with that." But even as he spoke the reassuring words, Jed felt a familiar knot of fear in his stomach. The storm was making everything more dangerous. If something went wrong during the birth, if Sarah needed help he couldn't provide, they were completely cut off from any outside assistance. The nearest veterinarian was 40 miles away, and in this weather the roads would be impassable for days. Around midnight, Sarah's contractions began in earnest. She lay on her side in the makeshift nest, her body rigid with effort as she worked to bring her young into the world. Jed sat nearby with the medical kit open beside him, ready to help if needed, but trying not to interfere with the ancient process. The first pup arrived just after 1 in the morning, a small, dark bundle that Sarah immediately began cleaning with fierce dedication. The sight of new life, wet and helpless but undeniably alive, brought tears to Jed's eyes. It had been so long since he'd witnessed a beginning instead of an ending. "That's a fine pup," he whispered, watching Sarah work. Strong and healthy from the looks of it, the second pup followed 20 minutes later, lighter in color than its sibling but equally vigorous. Sarah tended to both babies with the instinctive skill of new motherhood, her earlier pain forgotten in the joy of caring for her offspring. But the third pup was different. It arrived in a rush of blood and fluid. Small and still, its tiny body limp and unresponsive. Sarah cleaned it frantically, licking and nudging, trying to stimulate the breath that would not come. When her efforts failed, She lifted her head and released a sound that Jed had never heard before, a keening wail of pure grief that seemed to contain all the sorrow in the world. The sound shattered something inside Jed's chest. He knelt beside Sarah and gently lifted the lifeless pup, cradling it in his cupped palms. It was perfectly formed but impossibly small, its eyes sealed shut, its mouth slightly open as if it had been trying to cry. "I'm sorry, girl," Jed whispered, his voice breaking. "Sometimes these things happen. It's nobody's fault." But even as he spoke the words, the familiar weight of guilt settled on his shoulders. He should have done something different, should have been more prepared, should have found a way to save this tiny life. The pattern was always the same. Everything he touched eventually died, and those he loved paid the price for his failures. Sarah continued to mourn her lost pup, her cries echoing through the cabin and mixing with the howl of the wind outside. The surviving pups, oblivious to the tragedy, nuzzled against her warm belly and began their first tentative attempts to nurse. Jed sat with his back against the wall, the dead pup still cradled in his hands, and let the tears come. He cried for the baby wolf who would never run through mountain meadows or learn to hunt. He cried for Thomas, whose journals would never be filled with observations about wolf behavior. He cried for Sarah, both Sarahs, and for all the dreams that had died before they could fully bloom. "I know it hurts," he told the grieving mother wolf. "Losing a child is like losing a piece of your own soul. But you've got two beautiful babies who need you now. They need you to be strong." As if she understood his words, Sarah gradually quieted her mourning and turned her attention to the living pups. They were nursing eagerly now, their tiny paws kneading against her belly as they fed. Life was asserting itself despite the loss, demanding to be nurtured and protected. Jed wrapped the stillborn pup in a soft cloth from the medical kit. One of the mason jars that had once held Sarah's preserves had contained clean bandages, carefully stored away for emergencies. The jar itself sat empty on a shelf, a reminder of domestic happiness and the preservation of good things for lean times. Now it would serve a different purpose, holding memories instead of sustenance. "I'll bury him proper when the storm passes," he promised Sarah. "He'll have a good place to rest, somewhere with morning sun and a view of the mountains." The wolf looked at him with those amber eyes, and for a moment the grief they shared created a bond deeper than species. Deeper than the artificial barriers between wild and tame. They were both parents who had lost children, both survivors carrying wounds that would never fully heal. As dawn broke grey and sullen over the storm-lashed landscape, Jed found himself thinking about the future for the first time in years. The two surviving pups would grow quickly, would need more food and space as they developed. They would learn to walk, to play, to hunt, and eventually they would need to return to the wild where they belonged. But for now they were safe and warm and loved. Their mother was alive and healing. Their human protector was committed to their welfare. And the cabin that had been a monument to loss was becoming something new, a sanctuary where life could begin again. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the circle of firelight, hope was taking root, like the first green shoots of spring pushing through winter snow. It was fragile and tentative, but it was real, and maybe, just maybe, it would be enough to carry them all through to whatever came next. 3 weeks after the pups were born, the old radio crackled to life with news that made Jed's blood run cold. Several head of cattle found mutilated on the Morrison Ranch, the tinny voice announced through waves of static. Local rancher Buck Morrison is calling for organized wolf hunts to eliminate what he calls the predator problem. County Sheriff has issued hunting permits for any wolves found on private land. Jed's hand froze on the radio dial. The Morrison Ranch bordered his property to the east, and Buck Morrison was not known for his patience or his mercy. If Buck suspected there were wolves in the area, he wouldn't stop until every last one was dead. Sarah lifted her head from where she lay nursing her pups. Her ears pricked at the tension in Jed's voice. The 2 surviving pups had grown remarkably in their short lives. Their eyes had opened to reveal startling blue that would eventually change to amber, and they were beginning to venture beyond their mother's immediate warmth to explore the cabin's corners. Jed had tried not to name them, telling himself it was better to maintain distance. But watching them tumble over each other in play, seeing their distinct personalities emerge, had worn down his resistance. The larger pup, bold and adventurous, had become scout in his mind. The smaller one, more cautious but fiercely determined, he'd started thinking of as hope. "We might have visitors soon," he told Sarah quietly, turning down the radio's volume. "Folks looking for wolves to blame for their troubles." The irony wasn't lost on him. Buck Morrison's cattle had probably been killed by coyotes or wild dogs, but wolves made better villains. They were big enough to be frightening, rare enough to be mysterious, and wild enough to represent everything that civilized men wanted to control or destroy. Jed had tangled with Buck Morrison before, years ago when Thomas was still alive. Buck had been setting illegal snares on Jed's land, claiming he was protecting his livestock from predators. When Jed confronted him about it, Buck had threatened to have him arrested for interfering with ranch business. Only the intervention of the old sheriff had prevented the situation from escalating into violence. Now Buck was organizing hunting parties, and the new sheriff was a man Jed didn't know, someone who might be more sympathetic to ranchers than to hermits who harbored wolves. Over the next few days, Jed found himself jumping at every sound outside the cabin. When deer moved through the woods, he reached for his rifle. When the wind rattled the shutters, he checked the locks. The peaceful sanctuary he'd created for Sarah and her pups was beginning to feel like a fortress under siege. The tension affected the whole family. Sarah became more protective of her pups, growling softly whenever Jed approached too quickly. Scout and Hope seemed to sense the change in atmosphere, staying closer to their mother and startling at noises that hadn't bothered them before. "I won't let them hurt you," Jed promised one evening as he watched the pups play with a piece of rope he'd given them. "Whatever it takes, I won't let those men get near you." But even as he spoke the words, Jed knew how hollow they sounded. He was one man against what could be dozens of hunters, and his property wasn't large enough to hide a wolf family indefinitely. If Buck Morrison was determined to eliminate every wolf in the county, it was only a matter of time before he traced the tracks leading to Jed's cabin. The radio became both his lifeline and his torment. Each evening, he would tune in to the local news, listening for updates on the hunt while dreading what he might hear. The reports were getting worse. More ranchers were claiming livestock losses, and the bounty on wolf pelts had been raised to $50 each. $50 was more money than most men in the county saw in a month. For that kind of reward, neighbors would turn against neighbors, and friends would sell out friends. The gold rush mentality that had once driven men to tear apart mountains in search of precious metal was now focused on finding and killing wolves. One night, as Jed sat cleaning his rifle by the fire, he found himself thinking about Thomas's journal. The boy had written extensively about wolves, fascinated by their intelligence and social structure. Thomas had dreamed of observing them in the wild, of documenting their behaviors and contributing to the scientific understanding of their species. "Wolves are not monsters," Thomas had written in his careful script. "They are complex creatures with strong family bonds and sophisticated communication. Humans fear them because we see too much of ourselves in their eyes. The capacity for both tenderness and violence. The struggle to survive in a world that doesn't always provide enough for everyone." The journal was still in Thomas's room, locked away with all the other reminders of his lost son. But Jed could remember every word the boy had written about wolves, every observation and theory and hope for future study. Thomas would have loved Sarah and her pups, would have spent hours watching them and taking notes about their development. "Your boy was wise," Jed told Sarah, stroking her fur as she nursed the pups. "He understood your kind better than most humans ever will. He would have stood up for you, just like I'm gonna do." The next morning brought visitors. Not the hunters Jed had been expecting, but something almost as unwelcome. Mrs. Eleanor Henley, his nearest neighbor, stood on his porch with a basket in her hands and concern written across her weathered face. Jedediah Kane, you open this door right now, she called out in the voice that had cowed 3 generations of schoolchildren. I know you're in there and we need to talk. Jed glanced at Sarah, who had already moved her pups to a hiding spot behind the wood stove. The wolf's instincts were telling her to disappear, but there was nowhere to go. The cabin was their sanctuary, but it was also their trap. Just a minute, Mrs. Henley, Jed called back, his mind racing. Eleanor Henley was a good woman, but she was also a talker. Whatever she saw here would be common knowledge throughout the county within days. He had to make a choice, trust her with his secret or find a way to turn her away without arousing suspicion. Either way, his days of peaceful isolation were numbered. Eleanor Henley had always been able to see through lies like glass through water. Jed opened the door just wide enough to step outside, pulling it closed behind him with what he hoped looked like casual nonchalance. The basket in Mrs. Henley's arms smelled of fresh bread and cinnamon, reminders of a social world he'd abandoned 3 years ago. Eleanor, he said, touching the brim of his hat. Kind of you to come by, but as you can see, I'm doing just fine on my own. She fixed him with the same look that had made him confess to stealing apples from her orchard when he was 8 years old. At 73, Eleanor Henley still had the sharpest eyes and quickest mind in 3 counties. Jedediah Kane, you look like a scarecrow that's been left out too many winters, she said, setting the basket on the porch rail. And don't you try to shuffle me off like I'm some traveling salesman. I've got things to tell you, important things. Behind the cabin door, Jed could hear the soft sounds of the pups stirring. Scout had developed a habit of yipping in his sleep, and Hope had taken to scratching at the floorboards when she was excited. If Mrs. Henley heard those sounds and started asking questions, he couldn't answer. Maybe we could walk down to the creek, Jed suggested, trying to guide her away from the cabin. It's a nice day for a stroll, and I could use the exercise. But Eleanor was already studying the porch with the attention to detail that had made her the best teacher in the county for 40 years. Her gaze lingered on the muddy boot prints, the scratches in the wood that could have been made by claws, the faint scent that even human noses could detect if they knew what to look for. Buck Morrison came by my place yesterday, she said without preamble. He's organizing hunting parties, offering good money for wolf pelts. Says there's a pack in these mountains that's been killing his cattle. Jed's hand moved instinctively toward the door handle. That's so. Haven't seen any wolves myself. Jed, Eleanor's voice was gentle but firm. I've known you since you were knee-high to a grasshopper. I knew your Sarah, God rest her soul. And I watched you raise that boy with more love than most children ever see. I also know when you're protecting something. The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Behind the door, Jed could hear Sarah moving around, probably positioning herself to defend her pups if necessary. The wolf had excellent instincts about when humans posed a threat. There's something else, Eleanor continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. Buck Morrison's been drinking heavy lately, talking about old grievances. He mentioned Thomas's accident, said some things that didn't sit right with me. A chill ran down Jed's spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air. What kind of things? Eleanor reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a worn recipe book, Sarah's old collection of family dishes and remedies that she'd shared with the neighborhood women. Jed recognized the careful handwriting, the food stains on pages that had been used countless times to feed family and friends. Your Sarah copied this recipe for me years ago, Eleanor said, opening to a page marked with a pressed flower. Wild game stew with herbs for healing. She said it was good for mending more than just the body, that sharing food with hurting creatures was a way of sharing hope. The message was clear without being spoken. Eleanor knew about the wolves, or at least suspected, and she was offering her support in the coded language that mountain people used when direct words were too dangerous. Sarah always did have a way with hurt animals, Jed said carefully. Yes, she did. And she passed that gift on to you and Thomas. Eleanor closed the recipe book and tucked it back into her pocket. Buck Morrison never understood that gift. He sees killing as the answer to everything he doesn't like or can't control. From inside the cabin came a soft thump, followed by what sounded like a puppy's protest. Eleanor's eyebrows rose slightly, but she didn't comment directly. "I brought you some supplies," she said instead, nodding toward the basket. "Fresh bread, some of that willow bark tea that's good for pain, and a few other things that might come in handy for someone who's been caring for injured creatures." Jed lifted the basket and felt the weight of more than food. Beneath the bread were bottles of antiseptic, clean bandages, and several packets of dried herbs that he recognized from Sarah's old remedies. Eleanor had come prepared to help with whatever wounded animals he might be sheltering. "Buck's planning to search this area within the week," she said quietly. "He's got 6 men signed up already, and they're talking about using dogs to track. You might want to consider whether any creatures you're helping might be safer somewhere else." The suggestion hit Jed like a physical blow. Move Sarah and the pups? They were barely 3 weeks old, still dependent on their mother's milk, still vulnerable to cold and stress. But keeping them here might mean watching them die in front of his eyes, and that was a torment he couldn't bear again. "There's an old ranger station up on Widow's Peak," Eleanor continued, her voice so low he had to strain to hear it. "Been abandoned for 5 years. But it's got a stone foundation and a good roof. Remote enough that hunters wouldn't think to look there, at least not right away." She was offering him an escape route, a way to save the lives he'd been protecting. But it would mean leaving his home, abandoning the cabin where he'd built his life with Sarah and raised Thomas. It would mean stepping back into a world that had caused him nothing but pain. "Think about it, Jed," Eleanor said, turning to leave. "Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is run toward an uncertain future instead of staying trapped in a painful past." As she walked away, her final words floated back to him on the mountain air. "Your Sarah, both of them, would want you to choose life over death, hope over despair. Don't let Buck Morrison take that choice away from you." Jed stood on the porch long after Eleanor's figure disappeared into the trees, the weight of decision settling on his shoulders like a yoke. Inside the cabin, his wolf family waited, trusting him to keep them safe. He had less than a week to decide their fate. Buck Morrison arrived at dawn with 2 armed men and a heart full of old hatred. Jed heard the horses before he saw them. The sound of hooves on frozen ground cutting through the morning stillness like gunshots. Sarah's ears were already flat against her head, her lips pulled back in a silent snarl as she moved her pups behind the wood stove. The wolf knew the sound of hunters better than any domesticated animal ever could. "Stay quiet, girl," Jed whispered, checking his rifle one more time. "Whatever happens, you keep those babies safe." Through the window, he could see 3 riders approaching the cabin, with the slow confidence of men who believed they held all the power. Buck Morrison rode in the center, his bulk filling the saddle of a horse that looked as mean-tempered as its rider. The 2 men flanking him were strangers to Jed, young and hard-faced, the kind of drifters who would do anything for money and ask no questions about the work. Jed stepped onto the porch, with his rifle cradled in his arms, not exactly pointing it at the visitors, but making sure they could see it clearly. "Morning, Buck. You're trespassing on private property." Buck Morrison hadn't changed much in the 3 years since Jed had last seen him. He was still thick around the middle and thin on top, with small eyes that held too much cunning and not enough conscience. But there was something different about him today. A nervous energy that made him fidget with his reins and glance around as if he expected trouble. "Now, Jed, that ain't no way to greet old neighbors," Buck said, his voice carrying the false friendliness of a snake oil salesman. "We're here on official business. County's authorized us to search for the wolves that have been killing my cattle." "Haven't seen any wolves," Jed replied evenly. "You might try looking over toward the national forest. Wolves tend to avoid human settlements." One of Buck's men, a scarred young tough with dead eyes, spat tobacco juice into the snow. "We ain't asking for permission, old man. We got legal authority to search anywhere we think wolves might be hiding." Buck held up a hand to silence his companion, but his eyes never left Jed's face. "The thing is, Jed, we found some interesting tracks leading this way. Wolf tracks, fresh as yesterday's snow. Now, I know you always had a soft spot for wild animals, just like that boy of yours did. The mention of Thomas sent a spike of rage through Jed's chest, but he kept his voice level. "Leave my son out of this, Buck. Funny thing about your boy," Buck continued, his tone growing more conversational and therefore more dangerous. "I was just thinking about that hunting accident of his. Terrible tragedy, a young man dying all alone in the woods like that." Behind Jed, he heard the soft sound of Sarah moving her pups to an even more secure hiding place. The wolf's maternal instincts were screaming at her to protect her young, and Jed could feel the same protective fury building in his own chest. "What are you getting at, Buck?" "Well, it's just that I remember being in those woods that same day. Had some business up there, checking my trap lines." Buck's smile was as cold as the morning air. Heard a young voice calling for help, real desperate-like. "But you know how it is when you're busy with important work. Sometimes a man can't drop everything to play hero." The words hit Jed like physical blows. Thomas had been calling for help. Someone had heard him crying out as he lay trapped and bleeding, and that someone had chosen to walk away. "You son of a—" Jed started forward, his rifle coming up, but Buck's hired guns were already reaching for their weapons. Now, Buck said, holding up both hands in mock surrender. "No need for harsh words between neighbors. I'm just saying that accidents happen when people don't pay attention to where they're stepping. Your boy should have been more careful about whose trap lines he was checking." The truth crashed over Jed like an avalanche. Thomas hadn't died from his own mistake. He'd been caught in one of Buck Morrison's illegal snares, and Buck had heard him dying and chosen to let it happen, rather than face the consequences of his poaching. "You killed my boy," Jed whispered, his voice barely audible. "Now that's a serious accusation," Buck replied, but his nervous fidgeting had stopped. He was watching Jed with the attention of a predator who'd finally cornered his prey. Mighty serious indeed. The kind of thing that could get a man into trouble if he went around repeating it without proof. Thomas's journal. Jed could see it clearly in his memory. The leather-bound book where his son had recorded every detail of his wilderness explorations. The journal that contained careful maps of all the trap lines in the area, including notes about illegal snares on Kane property. The journal that Buck Morrison had probably been looking for ever since Thomas died. "That boy of yours kept detailed records," Buck said, as if reading Jed's thoughts. "Always scribbling in that little book of his. I wondered what happened to all those notes he took. Be a shame if the wrong people got hold of information about legitimate business activities." The threat was clear. Buck knew that Thomas's journal contained evidence of his illegal trapping, evidence that could put him in prison. He'd come here not just to hunt wolves, but to silence the one man who might have proof of his guilt. From inside the cabin came a sound that made Jed's blood freeze, the distinctive yip of a wolf pup. Scout had chosen the worst possible moment to make his presence known. Buck Morrison's head snapped toward the sound, his eyes widening with predatory interest. Well, Buck said slowly. "Sounds like we found what we came looking for." The two hired guns dismounted and started toward the cabin, but Jed stepped into their path with his rifle raised. "Nobody goes in there." "Stand aside, Jed," Buck commanded, his false friendliness dropping away to reveal the cruel bully underneath. "Those wolves are going to die today, and if you try to stop us, you might just have yourself another tragic accident." Sarah appeared in the cabin doorway, her hackles raised and her teeth bared in a snarl that promised violence. She was outnumbered and outgunned, but she was a mother protecting her young, and that made her more dangerous than any weapon. "That's her," Buck breathed, his hand moving to the pistol on his hip. "That's the bitch that's been killing my cattle. Boys, we just hit the jackpot." But as Buck reached for his gun, something unexpected happened. The wolf stepped forward to place herself between Jed and the armed men, her loyalty to her human protector overriding even her maternal instincts. She was choosing to fight alongside him rather than flee with her pups. "Sarah, no," Jed whispered. But the wolf had already made her decision. The moment hung balanced on a knife's edge, 3 armed men facing one hermit and a protective wolf, with 2 helpless pups hidden in the shadows. Blood was about to be spilled, and Jed knew that whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine whether justice or cruelty would triumph. Buck Morrison had killed Thomas and walked away laughing. He'd tortured Sarah and left her to die in the snow. Now he'd come to finish what he'd started, to eliminate every witness to his crimes. But this time, Jed wasn't going to let evil win without a fight. The standoff stretched like a bowstring, pulled to its breaking point. Buck Morrison's hand hovered over his pistol, while his two hired guns flanked out to either side, their rifles already half raised. Sarah stood between Jed and the armed men, every muscle in her body coiled for attack. Her amber eyes locked on Buck's face, as if she could smell the evil that radiated from him like heat from a forge. "You've got yourself a real problem here." "Jed," Buck said, his voice deceptively calm, "harboring dangerous predators is a federal offense. These wolves have been terrorizing honest ranchers, killing livestock, threatening children. The law's on my side." Jed kept his rifle steady, but his mind was racing through possibilities. 3 against 1 were bad odds, and even if he could take down Buck, the other two would likely kill both him and Sarah before he could reload. The wolf was brave, but courage wouldn't stop bullets. "Funny thing about those cattle killings," Jed said, playing for time. "I heard tell they were torn up pretty bad. But wolves don't kill for sport, Buck. They take what they need and move on. What you described sounds more like the work of dogs or men trying to make." "It looked like wolves did it." One of Buck's hired guns, the younger one with nervous eyes, glanced at his employer with something that might have been uncertainty. But the scarred tough just spat another stream of tobacco juice and kept his rifle trained on Jed. "You calling me a liar?" Buck demanded, his face flushing red with anger. "I'm saying that wolves make convenient scapegoats for men who don't want to face up to their own failures," Jed replied. "Always easier to blame the predators than admit you can't protect your own stock." From inside the cabin came another small sound, Hope's distinctive whimper as she searched for her mother. Sarah's ears twitched at the sound, but she didn't break her protective stance. The wolf was fighting every instinct that told her to retreat to her pups, choosing instead to trust that her human partner would keep them all safe. Buck's eyes narrowed at the sound. "How many of them you got in there, Jed?" "A whole pack? No wonder my cattle been disappearing." "Your cattle been disappearing because you're too cheap to fix your fences and too lazy to guard them proper," Jed shot back. "But it's easier to blame wolves than do the work of being a real rancher." The insult hit home. Buck's face went from red to purple, and his hand dropped to his gun. "I've had enough of your smart mouth, hermit. Boys, we're going in there and cleaning out that nest of killers." But before anyone could move, the sound of approaching horses echoed through the forest. Buck's head snapped around, his confident expression faltering, as he recognized that his carefully planned raid was about to have unexpected witnesses. Eleanor Henley emerged from the tree line first, riding her old mare with the straight-back dignity of a cavalry officer. Behind her came 3 other riders, the new game warden, a man Jed didn't recognize, and surprisingly Dr. Sarah Whitmore, the veterinarian from town. "Buck Morrison," Eleanor called out in her schoolteacher voice, "the one that had made grown men quake in their boots. What exactly do you think you're doing on Mr. Kane's property?" Buck's hired guns looked uncertain now, faced with witnesses who couldn't be intimidated or bought off. The nervous one actually lowered his rifle, while the scarred tough kept his weapon ready but didn't quite point it at anyone. "Mrs. Henley," Buck said, trying to regain his composure. "We're here on official business. Tracking wolves that have been killing livestock." "Official business?" The game warden, a lean, middle-aged man with intelligent eyes, dismounted and approached the group. "I don't recall authorizing any wolf hunting on private property, Mr. Morrison, and I certainly don't remember issuing permits to these gentlemen." He nodded toward Buck's hired guns, and Jed could see the man's trained eye taking in their appearance, the kind of hard cases who hired out for jobs that decent men wouldn't take. Dr. Whitmore dismounted as well, her medical bag in hand. She was a small woman with graying hair and gentle hands, the kind of person who'd spent her life healing rather than hurting. "I received word that there might be injured animals in need of care," she said. looking directly at Jed. "Mrs. Henley thought my services might be required." The photograph in Jed's mind, the sepia-toned image of him, Sarah and young Thomas that sat on his bedroom dresser, suddenly felt like a talisman of protection. That picture represented everything he'd fought for, everything he'd lost, and everything he was trying to save now. His family had been about love and protection, and choosing to care for creatures that couldn't care for themselves. "Dr. Whitmore," Jed said carefully, "there might indeed be animals here that could use your attention. Wild animals that have been hurt by cruel men." Buck's face was now white with rage rather than red. His carefully planned raid was falling apart, and the arrival of official authority meant he couldn't simply silence witnesses and claim self-defense. "This is harassment," Buck snarled. "A man's got a right to protect his property from predators. A man's got a right to follow the law," the game warden replied calmly. "And the law says that wolf hunting requires proper permits on the right land, with licensed hunters. I don't see any of those requirements being met here." Eleanor Henley had remained mounted, using the height advantage to survey the scene like a general studying a battlefield. "Mr. Morrison," she said in that crisp voice that brooked no argument, "I believe you have some questions to answer about your recent livestock losses. Questions about whether those losses actually occurred, and if so, what really caused them." The implication was clear. Eleanor had been doing some investigating of her own, and she'd found discrepancies in Buck's story. Buck's nervous hired gun was backing toward his horse now, clearly wanting no part of whatever was about to unfold. But the scarred tough remained in position, his loyalty bought and paid for by whatever Buck was offering him. Sarah sensed the shift in the confrontation's dynamics. She remained alert and ready, but some of the terrible tension had gone out of her stance. The wolf understood that the odds had changed, that her human pack now outnumbered their enemies. "There's something else, Buck," Eleanor continued, reaching into her saddlebag. "Something I found when I was cleaning out the old schoolhouse records." She pulled out a familiar leather-bound book, and Jed's heart nearly stopped. Thomas's journal, the one he'd thought was safely hidden in his son's room. Young Thomas Kane was quite the naturalist, Eleanor said, opening the journal to a marked page. He kept detailed records of his observations, including maps of all the trap lines in this area. Very detailed maps showing exactly where certain illegal snares were set on private property. Buck's face had gone ashen. "That book don't prove nothing, doesn't it?" The game warden stepped forward, extending his hand toward Eleanor. "May I see that, ma'am?" As Eleanor handed over the journal, Buck made his decision. His hand dropped to his gun, but this time not to threaten, to draw. The cornered animal was about to fight, with all the desperate fury of the truly damned. "Nobody moves!" Buck shouted, his pistol clearing its holster. "That boy was trespassing on my land, and he got what trespassers deserve. Just like these wolves are going to get what they deserve." But Sarah had been waiting for exactly this moment. As Buck's attention focused on the humans, the wolf launched herself forward in a blur of muscle and fury, her jaws aimed at the hand holding the gun. The final confrontation had begun, and everything Jed had lost and everything he'd found was about to be decided in the space of a few desperate heartbeats. Sarah struck Buck Morrison like a lightning bolt wrapped in fur and fury. The wolf's jaws clamped down on his gun hand with the precision of a surgeon and the force of a steel trap. Buck's scream cut through the mountain air as his pistol went flying, landing in the snow 20 feet away. He crashed backward off his horse, Sarah riding him down with the relentless determination of a predator that had finally cornered its tormentor. "Get it off me!" Buck shrieked, trying to beat at the wolf with his free hand. "Shoot it! Shoot the damn thing!" But his hired guns were facing their own problems. The scarred tough had swung his rifle toward Sarah, but Jed was already moving, his own weapon coming up with the smooth precision of a man who'd been hunting since childhood. The crack of his rifle echoed through the forest, and the tough's weapon spun from his hands as the bullet shattered the stock. The nervous gunman threw down his weapon entirely and raised his hands. "I ain't getting paid enough for this," he declared, backing toward his horse. This was supposed to be easy money, not a war. Eleanor Henley had her own rifle out now, a Winchester that looked older than she was, but was obviously well-maintained and ready for use. Anyone else feeling like they might want to rethink their life choices? She inquired pleasantly. The game warden had his sidearm drawn and was moving to secure Buck's dropped pistol, while Dr. Whitmore dismounted with her medical bag. Ready to treat whatever wounded might need attention when the violence ended, Sarah released Buck's mangled hand and backed away, her yellow eyes never leaving his face. The wolf had proven her point. She was no helpless victim to be chained and tortured. She was a mother defending her young, and that made her more dangerous than any man with a gun. Buck rolled onto his side, clutching his bleeding hand to his chest. "You're all gonna pay for this," he gasped. "That wolf attacked me without provocation. I got witnesses. What I witnessed," Eleanor said calmly, "was a man drawing a gun on unarmed neighbors while making threats about killing children. Mrs. Morrison might be interested to know what her husband does when he thinks nobody's watching." The wooden cross that Jed had carved for Thomas's grave flashed through his mind. A simple marker he'd made with his own hands, carved with the boy's name, and the dates that bookended a life cut short. That cross represented faith in something larger than revenge, hope for justice beyond what human hands could deliver. "You killed my son," Jed said quietly, his rifle still trained on the scarred gunman, who was slowly reaching for a backup pistol in his boot. "You set illegal traps on my land, and when Thomas got caught in one, you heard him calling for help and walked away." "Can't prove that," Buck muttered. But his eyes were darting around like a trapped animal looking for an escape route. The game warden held up Thomas's journal. According to these notes, young Thomas documented 6 illegal snares on Kane property in the weeks before his death. He also noted that someone had been setting them in game trails, places where they were most likely to catch animals or people who weren't expecting them. Dr. Whitmore had approached Buck cautiously, her medical training overriding any personal feelings about treating a man who'd caused so much suffering. "That hand needs immediate attention," she said professionally. "The wolf's teeth went deep, and there's already signs of infection setting in." "Don't you touch me," Buck snarled, trying to crawl away from her. "I ain't taking help from no wolf lovers." From inside the cabin came the sound of the pups calling for their mother, high, thin cries that spoke of hunger and need. Sarah's ears swiveled toward the sound, torn between her protective instincts toward Jed and her maternal duty to her young. "Go to them," Jed told her gently. "Your babies need you. We've got this handled." The wolf looked at him for a long moment, those amber eyes seeming to weigh his promise against the evidence of her own senses. Then she turned and trotted back toward the cabin, her tail held high in the manner of a wolf who had successfully defended her territory. The scarred gunman made his move then, his backup pistol clearing his boot as he brought it up toward Jed. But Eleanor Henley's Winchester spoke first, the bullet taking the man's hand off at the wrist with the kind of precision that spoke of decades of practice. "I was the county's best shot for 37 years running," Eleanor said conversationally as the gunman collapsed screaming. "Some skills you just don't lose." Buck Morrison looked around at the scene, his hired guns defeated, his crimes exposed, his victims standing over him with justice in their eyes, and for the first time in his life, he understood what it felt like to be the prey instead of the predator. The new sheriff arrived as Dr. Whitmore was bandaging the wounded men, his badge gleaming in the morning sunlight like a promise of justice finally delivered. Sheriff David Reeves was everything his predecessor hadn't been: honest, thorough, and more interested in truth than in who could offer the biggest bribe. He'd been asking questions about livestock losses and suspicious death reports since taking office 6 months ago, and the scene at Jed's cabin was providing answers he'd been seeking. "Mr. Morrison," Sheriff Reeves said, studying the journal that the game warden had handed him, "according to these records, you've been setting illegal snares on private property for years. That's a federal offense, especially when it results in the death of a human being." Buck Morrison sat propped against a tree, his bandaged hand cradled against his chest, his face pale from blood loss, and the crushing realization that his decades of bullying and cruelty were finally coming to an end. "That boy was trespassing," Buck mumbled. "Had no business being on my trap lines." "Your trap lines were on Mr. Kane's property," Sheriff Reeves replied patiently, "which makes you the trespasser. And according to several witnesses I've interviewed over the past month, you were heard bragging about hearing someone call for help and choosing not to respond." Eleanor Henley stepped forward, her rifle now resting in the crook of her arm. "Sheriff, there's something else you should know. I've been talking to some of the other ranchers, and their livestock losses don't match what Buck's been claiming. Most of their cattle that died were old or sick, and the wounds don't match what wolves would make. You saying I killed my own cattle?" Buck demanded, trying to summon his old bluster. "I'm saying you created a crisis that didn't exist so you could justify hunting wolves," Eleanor replied calmly. "And when that injured wolf showed up here, you saw a chance to eliminate a witness to your crimes." From inside the cabin came the sound of Sarah nursing her pups, soft growling noises that spoke of maternal contentment and safety. The wolf family was finally secure, protected by human laws instead of threatened by human cruelty. Sheriff Reeves holstered his weapon and pulled out handcuffs. "Buck Morrison, you're under arrest for illegal trapping, trespassing, reckless endangerment resulting in death, and conspiracy to commit animal cruelty. The federal authorities will want to talk to you about the poaching charges." As the sheriff cuffed Buck's good hand to his belt, the broken man finally seemed to understand that his reign of terror was over. "This ain't right," he whimpered. "I was protecting my livelihood. Wolves are killers. They'll destroy everything if you don't keep them in check." "The only killer here," Jed said quietly, "is you. You killed my son as surely as if you'd put a bullet in him. You tortured an innocent animal for your own twisted pleasure. You've spent years using fear and violence to get what you wanted." Dr. Whitmore approached Jed with her medical bag. "Mr. Kane, I understand you've been caring for injured wildlife. I'd like to examine them, make sure they're healthy and getting proper nutrition." Jed hesitated for a moment, old habits of isolation warring with new understanding that accepting help didn't mean weakness. Then he nodded and led her toward the cabin. "They're special animals," he said as they reached the door. "The mother wolf was tortured and left to die. I couldn't just walk away." "No decent person could," Dr. Whitmore agreed. "Sometimes the most important healing happens when we choose to care for creatures that can't care for themselves." Inside the cabin, Sarah looked up from her nursing pups with wary but curious eyes. She recognized the scent of medicine and healing from Dr. Whitmore, and after a moment of assessment, she allowed the woman to approach. "Beautiful family," Dr. Whitmore whispered, kneeling beside the makeshift nest. "The pups look healthy and well-fed. You've done excellent work caring for them." Scout and Hope looked up at the stranger with the fearless curiosity of young animals who had known only kindness from humans. They were thriving under Jed's protection, growing strong and confident in their safe haven. "What happens now?" Jed asked. "To them, I mean. They can't stay here forever." Dr. Whitmore smiled as she examined the pups with gentle hands. "That depends on what you want to happen. There's a wildlife preserve about 2 hours north of here, a place where wolves can live safely while still maintaining their wild nature." Or, she paused, studying Jed's face carefully. "Or they could stay here if you wanted to apply for a wildlife rehabilitation license. The state's always looking for qualified people to help with injured animals. Someone with your experience and dedication would be a valuable addition to the program." The offer hung in the air like a bridge between Jed's isolated past and a future filled with purpose. For the first time in 3 years, he could see a path forward that didn't involve hiding from the world or carrying his grief alone. Outside, Sheriff Reeves was loading Buck Morrison into his wagon, while Eleanor supervised with the satisfaction of a teacher who'd finally seen justice served to the classroom bully. The Wolf family was safe. The truth about Thomas's death had been revealed, and Jed had a choice to make about what kind of man he wanted to be for whatever years remained to him. Spring came early that year, melting the snow from Coldwater Ridge, and filling the mountain streams with the music of renewal. Jed stood on his porch in the warm April sunshine, watching Sarah and her nearly grown pups explore the meadow beyond the cabin. Scout had developed into a bold, confident young wolf with his father's size and his mother's intelligence. Hope, though smaller, possessed a fierce determination that reminded Jed of another Sarah, the woman who had faced down illness and hardship with unwavering courage. The new collar around Sarah's neck caught the morning light, its soft leather adorned with a small silver bell that chimed gently as she moved. Jed had crafted it himself during the long winter evenings, using skills his Sarah, had taught him years ago. The bell wasn't for tracking or control, but simply so he could hear the wolf family's approach when they came to visit. And they did visit, regularly and willingly. The wildlife rehabilitation license that Dr. Whitmore had helped him obtain allowed the wolves to remain on his property while maintaining their wild status. They were free to leave whenever they chose, but for now, they seemed content to call the area around Jed's cabin their territory. "Morning, Jed," Eleanor Henley called from the trail, leading her mare at an easy walk. At 73, she'd become a regular visitor, bringing news from town and helping with the steady stream of injured animals that people now brought to Jed's door. "Morning, Eleanor. Coffee's on if you're interested." She dismounted and tied her horse to the porch rail with the easy familiarity of someone who'd made this journey dozens of times. "I brought you something," she said, pulling a package from her saddlebag. "Came in on yesterday's mail." Jed unwrapped the package to find a bound journal, thick paper between leather covers, with his name embossed on the front in gold lettering. Inside the cover, an inscription read, "For Jedediah Kane, Wildlife Rehabilitation Specialist. Your work honors the memory of Thomas Kane, naturalist." "It's from the university," Eleanor explained. "They want you to document your observations about wolf behavior and rehabilitation." Seems young Thomas's journals made quite an impression on the wildlife biology department. Jed ran his fingers over the smooth leather, thinking about his son's dreams of becoming a naturalist, of contributing to scientific understanding of wildlife. Through this work, through the healing of broken creatures, Thomas's vision was finally coming to fruition. Sarah emerged from the woods with both pups, their morning hunt apparently successful. They approached the cabin without fear, Scout bounding ahead while Hope moved with more caution but equal curiosity. The bell on Sarah's collar announced their arrival with its gentle chiming. "How are my favorite patients today?" Dr. Whitmore asked, climbing the porch steps with her usual Tuesday morning visit. She'd become not just the wolves' veterinarian, but a trusted friend who understood the importance of what Jed was doing. "Scout's been testing his hunting skills on rabbits," Jed reported. "Hope prefers to practice her stalking techniques on my chickens, though she hasn't actually caught one yet. The pups were nearly 6 months old now, approaching the age when wild wolves would normally begin learning to hunt with their pack. Jed knew that soon they would need to make the choice between staying in their safe haven or venturing into the broader world to claim territory of their own. Eleanor settled into the rocking chair that Jed had built for her visits, accepting a cup of coffee with the satisfaction of someone who'd found her place in the world. "Buck Morrison's trial starts next month," she said. "Sheriff Reeves says they've got enough evidence to put him away for a long time." Jed nodded, feeling a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Justice for Thomas was important, but it couldn't bring the boy back or undo the years of grief that had followed his death. What mattered now was choosing to build something positive from the ruins of tragedy. "I got a letter from the State Wildlife Department," Jed said, pulling the official correspondence from his shirt pocket. "They want to expand the rehabilitation program. Think we could handle twice as many animals if we had the resources." "And?" Eleanor prompted, knowing him well enough to recognize when he was working up to something important. "And I'm thinking about saying yes. This place could help a lot of creatures that don't have anywhere else to go." Thomas would have liked that. Dr. Whitmore finished her examination of the wolves and approached the porch with a smile. "They're all in perfect health," she announced. "Sarah's recovered completely from her injuries, and the pups are developing exactly as they should. You've done remarkable work, Jed. As if summoned by praise, Sarah padded up to the porch and sat beside Jed's chair, her amber eyes calm and content. The wolf who had once been tortured and abandoned now radiated peace and security. Her trust in humans had been rebuilt through patience and kindness, proving that even the deepest wounds could heal given time and care. "You know what the best part is?" Eleanor asked, scratching behind Sarah's ears while the wolf submitted to the attention with dignified patience. "What's that?" "You're happy again, Jed. Really happy for the first time since we lost Sarah and Thomas. They'd be proud of what you've built here." Scout and Hope had discovered the rope toy that Jed had made for them, and their playful growling filled the air as they engaged in a spirited tug-of-war. The sound was pure joy, the kind of carefree happiness that only young creatures could achieve. The sun climbed higher, warming the mountain air and promising another beautiful day. Somewhere in the woods, a red-tailed hawk cried its hunting call, and Sarah's ears pricked attentively.